the rest of the time there. So Easter kind of, what I think is going on in Easter is that we see that there's all these kind of like these worried and pent up emotions, but we finally get a in that. Let me kind of explain what I mean by all of that. Throughout Lent, we have been going through this sermon series called The Way, kind of going through the Gospel of John. And the whole idea behind this is that oftentimes we think that if I can just get on the way of God, if I can just get on Jesus' path for my life, then all things will be great. Everything will go smooth for me. But still, we're going to have struggles and troubles and hardships and brokenness in our lives. And we can get discouraged when we face these. But that's when we look in Lent. We look at Black Friday, Good Friday, right? That's there's a lot of brokenness on Black Friday too. But you see that, and you see that even Jesus was broken, right? And so we now get to this new creation that is dawning here on Easter, right? That's kind of where we are. And I love how John tells the Easter story because he recognizes all the pain and the hurt and all that stuff, but he has these glimmers of whimsy to kind of tell you about it. Because there's kind of an adage that I live by. If you have a vacation or a trip or something like that goes well, like if you and your family decide to oh, hey, we're all going to go to Wyoming or somewhere that you would go. I don't know where you guys spend your time. If we go out there, then and nothing goes wrong, the hotel was perfect, everything was perfect. What's the story that you tell your friends? We went and we saw some hills, right? And they're cool. But man, if that trip goes off the rails, you get flat tires, you try to save $1, so you get one of the really cheap hotels in the middle of Kansas somewhere. And you get to the hotel and you go to lock the door and you realize that the deadbolt in the door frame, there's a hole in it, so it'll just swing wide open, right? Then you have the makings of you come home, you're this went off the rails. This trip happened over here. We stayed at this hotel and they said it was a king-size bed and it was a double and it's like someone slept in the middle of it and we just were constantly rolling towards each other the whole time. That's the kind of things, these struggles in our lives end up giving us good stories. Now I could tell you some real struggles of mine, but that would probably really depress some people. So we'll just talk about an old car that I have. All right. So this kind of illustrates what's going on in the Gospel of John. Back in 2001, I bought my first car. The cars I was driving, I was starting a first year of college. Cars I was driving before my parents got them for me. My first vehicle I drove was a Dodge Ram pickup with a slant 6 on it. It would go 0 to 60 sometimes, that thing was so slow. And it was a good first car for me, as the story now I will tell you. But then I saved all my pennies. In my first year of college, I bought a 1993 Nissan 240 SX, all right? Love this car. And I don't remember the exact day that I purchased this car, but I can look it up easily because I went over and gave the guy that was selling me the car, gave him the money for it. I think it was $3,500. It had 120,000 miles on it. All right, And so I bought this car, and then I went to go pick up my best friend. His name's Eric, the best man in my wedding. And this is before Coley. This is before the girlfriend, before Coley. Shh, don't say anything. That's. And so I get this car, pick up my best friend, and we go and see on opening night Fast and Furious. Right when I bought this, right? That's so I can look up the time when I bought this car, and it was great fun. And I had a friend named Ben. And I decided to go visit my friend Ben. He lived up in the North Georgia mountains. The reason why he lived up in the North Georgia mountains, remember this is 2001, his parents got a little freaked out about the Y2K thing, fled the city, I grew up in Atlanta, fled the city and went up into the North Georgia mountains to hide out. They never admitted that, but that's what was going on, right? So they fled out there. They didn't trust anything like that, all that stuff. And so he lived up there, and I had this car a month, and I love driving. I love cars. I love driving. My mom potty trained me on Hot Wheels cars. All right? I've loved cars since the day that I was potty trained, right? And so like so we had this here, and I had this car a month. I was like, I'm going to go visit my friend Ben. You could probably tell where this is going, maybe. So I go up into the North Georgia mountains, beautiful, windy, twisty roads, right? Remember, I had this car about a month. And it's just a great time, loving driving it. And there's two things, well, kind of three things that happened. One was, I'll freely admit it, it's probably driving a little faster than I should have. Surprise, surprise. Number two, there was like a flash minute-long shower that happened. Like just real fast, came and stopped, you know. And number three, the corner ended up being sharper as you went around it. All right? Like that, the corner ended up being sharper as you went around it. I actually have, this is Google images of that corner. And I have to point things out. I have to point things out to you real quick. Like this, you can see where the road goes now. They have fixed the road, all right? I have caused this to happen in multiple places, not in roads, but I had to have shoulder surgery, and there is now a gate to keep you from doing what I did that caused me to have shoulder surgery. And so, but the road actually used to come along like that, all right? See that there? So that's what the road used to do. You actually can still see the road over there. So it did that. So I'm going around there, and the turn is just getting sharper and sharper and sharper and sharper as I go around, and I'm starting to go off the edge, you know, off the road a little bit. And even though, like, listen, I'm a good driver, okay? If you guys doubt me, let's go to Andretti this afternoon, and I'll wipe the floor with all of you. like that's. I usually go there and hit the. Never mind. But I hit the brake in the middle of the corner to slow down. Front end, you know, all the weight goes to the front, back end slid around, and I went off the back. There's two images from this that I will always remember, right? The first one is when the car swung around, I looked behind me. I remember I looked behind and watched myself traveling backwards off of like a 20 to 30, like this is the mountains, remember. This is a 20 to 30 foot thing going off the edge there. And I like seeing that. And then the second thing I remember is like all of a sudden as I stopped over there, and the first thing that went in my head, I was like, the seatbelt did its thing. Like, because it was so tight on me. Like I was like, wow, like that's incredible. It was like incredible, like an engineering feat. Like, wow, this actually worked. You know, like kept me in the seat and all that. And I was like, oh my goodness. And I got out of the car and, you know, kind of trying to figure out, like, go through. Like, my car went over, like, a few, like, down trees. Like, it went, I was, you know, moving a clip and went straight off of it. And I'm like, and I always remember getting up to the top and looking down. I'm over 100 miles from my house. This is 2001. I had a cell phone, but it's before cell phones were doing real good. You know, I had no signal. I'm like, what? And I'm looking at my car that I've had a month. What am I going to do now? Right? Like, what am I going to do? And then all of a sudden I heard a voice. Now, it wasn't God. I don't tell those type of stories. All right? It was the lady that lived at that house. You could see it. It was the lady that she was like, hey, like yelling at me to come, and like all that. She was like coming. So I walked up to her house. And she's like, oh yeah, that turn is terrible. There's at least someone that goes off of it at least once a week. Like 3 days ago, there's a motorcyclist in there. And she's like, come on in. She poured me a glass of tea, handed me about 3 cards from Wrecker Services. Like that's, and it's just like, call one of these. And so like I called one of them. He came out, and they had to get like, I wish I had pictures of all this, but they had to like get the extensions out, you know, like to go down and get it. And they pulled the car up, and he pulled it up kind of a little ways down the road to get it off the road, to get out of traffic. and all that. And I went, how is it? And he's like, I don't know. And he like left. I paid the man and he left. And so I get in the car, like, what am I going to do now? Is it going to make it home? Like, what's going to happen? And I got in, started okay, and I went into first gear, because of course it's a manual, all right? And in first gear, then second and third, fourth, and got into fifth. And I was like, the car's good. It's good. And I drove it home. I drove that dumb car home. Like that car, that was the first incident with me in a car. Also in college, a tree fell on it and all kinds of stuff like that. I put another 100,000 miles on that car, right? Like that's, but I always remember like that. When I got it in the fifth gear, I was just like, well, everything's going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay. Like that's, and that idea and that storytelling and how all that is how John is talking about the resurrection of Jesus. Because think about how it starts. We kind of talked about this already, but Mary, it was the first day of the week. It's after the Passover. She comes to the tomb. She just wants to cry at the edge of the tomb, like when we lose one of our loved ones and we go to their gravestone, right? She just wants to go there and grieve. And she sees that the stone has been moved and the body is gone. Now we know that Christ is risen. I made that one easy, Anya. But she knows that, but she thinks someone has stolen the body. And she's like, oh no. And so she runs back home and she goes, it's like Peter and John. John is the one that's called, and the other disciple, the one who Jesus loved. He's the author of this story. He's the author of the book of John. And so she goes and gets Peter and John, and she's like, they've taken our Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him. You can hear the agony in the story here that Mary, she's like, this weekend has just gotten so much worse. It was already bad enough. We've seen the Lord get crucified. And we don't know what's going on. And now they're taking the body. And she's like, I can't believe what is happening. Why has this just gotten so much worse? And then John starts throwing some whimsy. Because remember, John is just like us. John knows how this story ends. Just like I know I put 100,000 miles on my red 240. Like that's over there, so I can tell that story in a certain way, right? Embellish a little bit here, have some fun with it over here. It's how we tell stories. Remember, when everything just goes well, it's boring stories, right? Some of you have some boring stories. Don't worry, I listen to them. Like a good soldier. Like that. But like that's when things go off the rails. That's when you get those real stories, right? But John adds whimsy. Look at the whimsy that he adds into this story. So Peter and the other disciple, remember that's John, they both started running towards the tomb. Now he doesn't have to add this. Look at the shade that John does. Both were running, but the other disciple, John, this is himself, outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Why is that in there? There's no theological bearing at all for this. There's nothing. Right? And you know after he wrote it, he calls up Peter. I don't know how you call up people in the day. I guess you got to show up face to face. Did you see what I wrote? That's that whole, it says he ran. He's like, I outran you. And Peter's like, not by that much, man. That's not nice. That's not nice. So we continue on. And he got there first, and he bent over and looked in at strips of linen lying there, but didn't go in. And then look how he words this with Peter. Then Simon Peter came along, behind him. All right? You can hear the finally in that, right? And then Simon Peter finally came along. He's like 5 minutes. I've been waiting for you. I was dying here waiting for you, right? Finally came along, and he went straight into the tomb. And he saw the strips of linen there. And there's some stuff about the strips of linen. That's not this sermon. Sorry, Ed. But that's Ed was helping me write this one a little bit here. It was, and I'm not using any of his stuff. And so, but they see this stuff, and it says that they believed. And I love the way it talks about this. I love this because it says they believed. And so often we think about faith, we're like, oh yes, they saw it and they understood perfectly and they believed. No. It even says, this is right after verse 9. He goes, they still didn't understand. They didn't get it. Man, how true is that? There's sometimes we just have these inklings about us, right? Like when you walk into that one hotel room in that sketchy place and you're like, I doubt that AC unit's going to work. Like you know that as soon as you walk in. Like this is I stayed at a hotel last summer that as soon as I noticed my room with a view, like I looked out of the window and I looked out over the roof of the atrium in front of us. And I could see, like it was actually over the kitchen, and I could see all the grease things, coming up out of it. And I knew at that point the AC was going to be terrible this entire conference, right? We just have these gut feelings about stuff. We know this. And so they have this, they have faith, but they just still don't understand. That's some gospel for us there, that they still didn't even fully understand. And then these guys did what they did. They're impulsive and they just run into the situation, completely not understanding, and then they just go back home. But where do we find Mary? Mary is still at the tomb. Mary's still there, and this is the part of the story that I really want to talk about because this is beautiful right here. And Mary is still crying on the side of the tomb, and she sees some incredible things. She sees angels at his foot and at his head where you're supposed to be. And they ask her, like, woman, why are you crying? And then Jesus himself shows up behind her. But she doesn't recognize him. And he says, woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you're looking for? And she thought he was the gardener, but let me explain that. That's a weird line. It's a beautiful line, and here's why it's beautiful. Is that John, the beginning of his story, he said the Word was made flesh and it dwelt among us. He speaks about the creation of the world. And the way that the Hebrew people understood the creation is that God's Spirit, His breath, His utterances, that how we talk, a breath comes and moves our vocal cords as we go out and we shape them into words. And that breath of God, that Spirit of God, because in Hebrew and Greek, spirit, breath, and wind are all the same word, by the way. So it's kind of all the same thing. That Spirit of God, that breath of God came out and it said, let there be light. And it all of a sudden light came in and created the sun, moon, stars, and all the things. He pulled out he pulled dry ground out of the waters, separated the waters from above, from below, created the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. He created all these things. And I have to say, in our early service, the 6:45 service, by the way, that is early. 6:45? It's so early. I set an alarm to wake up. I was like, all right, so I need to change my Sunday alarm from my normal time that I get up, which is still obscene, but it's all right. But I get up early, and when I set it at 8:30 last night, it said at 8:30, it said I have 7.5 hours to sleep. And that's way too. Some of you are like, I get up at 4 every day. like that's the way it is. You guys that aren't laughing at that are the ones that get up at 4. You're like, I don't get it. I don't get it. That's they start playing reruns of Jeopardy then. I got to watch it. And so it was early, but when I was doing that sermon outside, when I'm talking about birds of the air, we have a hawk, which, by the way, I saw scoop up one of those giant orange lizards the other day. I was like, whoa, nature, right? That's all of a sudden this hawk starts just doing its call, all over there, and it's just loud. And every time that hawk calls there, it's almost like the voice of God, the voice of the creation is just calling out in there. You can hear when God said, let us create all these things that creep and fly around and all these things. It's like you can hear the voice of God calling in that. Just like when the wind rushes through the trees and moves the bushes and causes the palmettos to clap their hands. It's like you can hear the voice of God still animating the creation all around it. This is the idea that John is getting across, and that God created this beautiful garden. that the Hebrew image of God in his creation is not this some unfeeling, unloving, just like, oh, let's just create this. Yay, I'm going to go do something else, right? It's just not that. It's like a gardener who's constantly cultivating with dirty hands, right? Like that's the image of God that John is playing with here. And it's amazing, the creation. We have a man who he always sits back where Heather sits. Heather's sitting back there. He's always sitting back. He's usually closer to the door. And he was listening to me preach one day, and for some reason he felt the inkling to look outside the door. It's not because he was bored. I preach very interesting sermons constantly. And he looked out the door, and there was a bobcat right on the other side of the door. Like another gloriousness of the creation when it makes its little meow. Is that what a bobcat does? I don't know if it's quite a roar. That's not quite right either, right? Like it's somewhere in between, like that bobcat, like that's like that voice of God in the glorious creation that is all around. Like this God that has put us in the garden. Sure, we mess things up, but that's the point. And you know, like just like how you go into those sketchy hotel rooms and you're like, this AC is not going to work. We can feel that about people too. Sometimes we may not see the person that's around us, but we can get a sense of them. Oh, that person's dangerous. Oh, that person's safe. Right? We can feel something about them. You know, like when one of your parents comes up kind of around you and is in your peripheral, you just know them. Maybe she could smell him or something like that. But look at the beautifulness of the language that John does. That Jesus says, why are you crying? Who is it that you're looking for? In that peripheral vision, she thought it was the gardener. Could she smell the dirt and the soil and of the cultivating, of making all things new, of bringing that luster of the creation that, yes, we have all felt that was hurting, that we felt it hurting because we saw, like when I looked at my car, down 30 feet into a little ravine just sitting there. And by the way, I think the reason why it wasn't damaged is because in Georgia we have something called kudzu. And some of you are like, what's a kudzu? Kudzu is the most vine that ever vined. It's just a mess of vines. I don't even think my car ever hit the ground. It hit kudzu and it caught it like a catcher's mitt, like just, right, like over there. Like it did it. And so I think that's why it didn't. But I remember looking at my car in that mass of kudzu, and it's like, what am I going to do now? But Mary, in all those feelings, she senses the gardener. And she's like, sir, if you've carried him away, just tell me. Just tell me and I'll go get him. And then Jesus, in that same breath that said, let there be light, in that same breath that said, let us make man and woman in our image. In the image of God, we will create them, male and female, we will make them. And in that same breath that uses to animate the trees and cause the palmettos to clap their hands, in that same breath that created the world and animates it and moves all around, that same breath of the bobcat roaring, I don't know, and the hawk doing its calls out in there, that same breath, he said to her, Mary. And instantly the voice of the gardener and the creator came colliding into her, and she heard the voice of that creator putting everything to right. And she goes, teacher, teacher. That's what I think Easter is all about. And I don't know what pain or hurt that you've been through, but I know you've been through it. I don't know how you've been held down and marginalized, but I know that you have. I don't know what you're worried about coming up or whatever relationships that you have. But here I'm telling you that the voice of God that created everything is creating in all things. And that wind is spirit moving through and animating the creation and callings of the bobcats and the hawks and all those things causes us where we can hear God's voice through all of it. Call each of our names. And just just like, I don't know, it feels more important than just like. But when I shifted into fifth and I went, I'm going to be okay. That voice of God calling through the creation, my name, I can go no matter what, I'll be fine. You'll be fine. Because you're loved. And we're with you, and God is with you. Have peace. Let's say a prayer. Lord, we thank you that you love us. Lord, whenever we feel like we're alone and on the outside, let us hear the voice that calls our name, that voice of God's Spirit that animates it all around, that says that we are loved and here, just like you called to Mary.